In this video, I want to go over what we covered in class today for those of you who are busy with the 8th graders, just some of the basics of congruence. And then I also want to just review what your homework is and also what the investigation we did in class was meant to do. So the first thing I want to look at is congruent triangles. What are congruent triangles? Congruent triangles are triangles with the same side lengths and the same angle measures. This means that all corresponding parts, meaning the sides and the angles, are congruent. So if a triangle has 3 sides and 3 angles, then we know that there should be 6 sets of things, 3 sets of angles, 3 sets of sides that are congruent. So let's talk about something called congruent statements. So when we want to say that 2 triangles are congruent, we write a congruent statement. It says that triangle ABC, or whatever triangle you have, list your vertices, is congruent to another triangle. So here we have a congruent statement. Now how do we come up with a congruent statement? Well, a valid congruent statement must match all corresponding angles and sides. So what you need to do is when you are confronted with the 2 triangles, you have to say to yourself, let's look at each angle. So if we look at angle A, you see it has 1 marking, and it is between a side length that has 1 mark and one that has 3 marks. So then we're going to look for an angle that has 1 mark in angle FED, and triangle FED. And if we see, oh look, D corresponds to A because, number 1, it's the same angle measure, and it's between 2 side lengths that are marked with 1 and 3. So that's why we have A in the first position, and D. So A and D correspond. Then I look at my second angle, angle B. Angle B has 2 markings, and it's between the sides that have a length of 1 marking and 2 markings. So I look at my triangle FED, and I see, oh look, angle E has 2 markings, and it's also between a side that has 1 marking and 2 markings. So B corresponds to E. Finally, we have angle C, which has 3 markings, which corresponds to F, and C is between 2 sides that are marked with 2 and 3, and F is marked with between 2 sides that are 2 and 3. So we see that C corresponds to F. You can say now that triangle ABC is congruent to DEF. You could also say that triangle CBA is congruent to triangle FED. You could also say that triangle EDF, or triangle BAC, is congruent to triangle EDF. In other words, as long as those sides are corresponding, you'll be fine. What you cannot say is that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle FED. That is incorrect. You cannot say that because A does not correspond to F, C does not correspond to D. So talking about corresponding parts, there's something called CPCTC. So what is that? CPCTC stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, which just means that if we know that 2 triangles are congruent, then we know that every pair of corresponding parts is also congruent. So let's look at a few examples. So in example 1, it says, in the directions say, list all congruent angles and sides given the congruency statement. So we're told that triangle JKL is congruent to triangle PQR. So angle-wise, we know that each of the vertices, JK and L and PQR, are ordered in a corresponding way. So if these 2 triangles are congruent, then we know that angle J is congruent to angle P. We also know that angle K has to be congruent to angle Q. And finally, we know that angle L must be congruent to angle R. Now, sides are a little bit trickier, but we know that there are 3 sides that make up triangle JKL. Right? The first side we can call JK, and it's going to be congruent to the other side PQ. We also know that KL must be congruent to side QR. And then finally, we know that LJ or JL, it doesn't really matter. I'll just do LJ for now. We know that has to be congruent to RP. So now we have two sets of congruent a set of congruent angles and a set of congruent sides. So 6 sets altogether, and it says write another valid congruent statement. Now remember, a congruency statement says that one triangle is congruent to another. So instead of writing triangle KJL is congruent to, or instead of saying triangle JKL is congruent to triangle PQR, I can say that triangle LKJ is congruent to triangle. Since I went in reverse order here, I have to go in reverse order in the other triangle, so I say RQP. So that's how you decide that's how you write congruent sides and angles. So let's take a look. I'm going to skip number 2. It's exactly like number 1, except with different letters. And I'm going to move on to number 3. It says, given that these two triangles are congruent, that triangle KPM is congruent to triangle AYC, complete each of the following statements. So when I come to a problem like this, the first thing I would suggest you do, and what I'm going to do, is to put in the markings. So I know that K is the same as A, so I'm going to make the same one angle marking. I know that P is the same as Y, and I know that M is the same as C. So now I've got my angle markings, and now I'm going to make my side markings, KP and AY, KP and AY, PM and YC, so PM and YC, and then finally our third side. So now I'm all set with my markings to fill my congruent statements in. So I have KM corresponds to CA, I have CY, I find the markings with 2, I go, oh, this has 2, so I see that this has 2, and then this has 2, so I know that CY corresponds to PM, and I know that PK goes with YA. Now I look at my angle Y. Y goes with angle P. Angle K corresponds to angle A. Angle AYC. So AYC, that's this angle. It has 2 markings, so that corresponds to angle P. Or instead, I'm going to say it corresponds to angle KPM. Notice I don't write MPK because M does not correspond with A. Rather, K corresponds with A. And it says triangle MPK. MPK is congruent to triangle, and I match up my letters. M corresponds with C, so C. P corresponds with Y, so Y. And K corresponds with A, so CYA. I'm going to do the same thing here with YAC. Y corresponds to P, so that's going to be triangle P. A corresponds to K, so that's K. And C corresponds to M, so it's M. So now I have 2 congruent statements that are different to the same triangles and the same congruency. So that's pretty much the only thing we covered, and that's exactly what your homework looks like. So your homework is to do numbers 1 through 6. Number 1 asks you to find the 3 valid congruency statements, so you can refer back to the problem we just did to see how you can rearrange the letters and the vertices to have multiple congruent statements. 2 and 3 are exactly like number 2 and number 1 of the practice problems that we just covered on the previous slide. Number 4 is very similar to number 3. And number 5 and 6 are a bit challenging. they have values, and I'm just curious to see if you can figure out the values based on the congruency statements and knowing what you know about triangles. So for example, in number 5, you know that C is 103, and C corresponds to Y. So you know that Y is 103. You know that Z is 45, and Z corresponds to B. So you know that B is 45 degrees. And finally, where does that leave you with M and R? Can you find those angles? So that's something to consider. Same thing with the sides. Look them through. See if you can find the values. So what we've just done has basically been describing congruent triangles and requiring us to find 6 different things that are congruent with the triangles to call them congruent triangles. So just like I said, so before, right, we have a list of 3 sets of angles, 3 sets of sides. But we don't need to have 6 pieces of information. We actually only need to have 3 pieces of information. So that was what our goal was today, is to explore what is the minimum qualification, right, the minimum amount of information that forces triangles to be congruent. So if you go to the website, it presents you with the different situations to explore to decide whether or not you have enough information to determine if triangles are congruent. So the first situation you explore is the side-side-side relationship. So is it enough to know the sides of a triangle, of 2 triangles, to be the same? So are 2 triangles guaranteed to be congruent if 3 sides of one triangle are congruent to 3 sides in another triangle? So your job in class was to explore and create your own triangle below and compare it with the triangles of your classmates. However, if you're doing this alone, you can just make a triangle, take note of the angle measures and the overall shape of it, and then try to create a different triangle. So make one that does not look like the one you did. Now, if you cannot create a different triangle, that means that knowing the 3 sides is enough to guarantee the same triangle. So if I move C1 and I move C, I eventually can overlap them and get a specific triangle. So here I see I have a 38, 60, and 82 degree triangle with side lengths of 5, 7, 8. Now you're going to get a triangle that also has sides 5, 7, and 8, and we want to see, are your angles the same as the angles I got? Or can you create a different triangle? So for me, no matter how I try to arrange this triangle otherwise, there's no way for me to get it to meet unless I, arrange it such that the angles are the ones that I just had. So I'll try it again, slightly down. So you're going to have to manipulate these. It's much easier if you do it on a computer. I suggest that if you have a computer available, you try it out on your computer and you can actually see the results much better. I'm doing it on my tablet and I'm having trouble, as you can see. But again, you'll see now I have 38, 69, and 82, and granted those are slightly off, but it's enough for me to be able to tell that I have 2 congruent triangles. So I know that if I had 3 sides of triangles that were the same in 2 different triangles, those triangles would have to look the same. You're going to continue this exploration on the website. So you'll move on after this triangle investigation. Oops. You'll move on to the next activity, which this was side, side, side. So then the next one I would imagine is angle, 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 and then so forth. So again, your job is just to explore these relationships and start considering whether or not it's enough to make congruent triangles. Finally, I want you to review the relationships that you explored. If you can write the sides and the angles of your triangle, and either your partners that you worked with today or another triangle that you were able to create on the computer, put those in. I know that some of the explorations don't have side lengths or angle measures, so obviously for those you can't. And then finally, I want you to tell me yes or no, is the given information enough to ensure triangles are congruent? So that is what I want you to do tonight. Again, if you have any questions, we can talk about it in class, and we're going to review these relationships in class and explore them further. So that is it. Have a good night.